We move along now with our next segment and want to introduce our next guest, Bill, because this is one of your brothers from the U.S. Marine Corps who's going to join us via telephone. With the administration's budget proposal now under review, where appropriations committees will decide future funding levels, many programs may be on the chopping block, including the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center, the NPRC. Sherman Gillums, Jr., Senior Director of the Public Policy and Advocacy at the Reeve Foundation and a Marine veteran living with paralysis, is here to offer insights into what the cuts would actually mean for individuals living with paralysis as well as their caregivers and families. Sherman, good morning. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your service to our country, sir.
I appreciate that. Good morning, gentlemen, and Semper Fi, Bill.
Semper Fi, brother.
Bill, I tell you what, Marine to Marine. Go ahead and take the first question, sir.
Yeah, I was reading some about you prior to us going on the air, and you have a very interesting history as far as in the damage that you sustained. Could you talk a little bit about that and give us a little background on you?
Sure. I was in the Marine Corps for 12 years, stationed at Camp Pendleton in 2002, preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. And I got in a simple car accident. It was simple in terms of how it unfolded, but it was with catastrophic effects. I had broken my neck and suffered a spinal cord injury. Went through about 2 years of rehabilitation in San Diego and found myself in the realm of advocacy for veterans with catastrophic injuries. If you were around that time, this would have been a time when men and women were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with similar injuries and much worse because it often involved traumatic brain injury and other things. But I was put there by God to do God's work, and I haven't looked back since.
Yeah, so many people would let that injury just disable them, but you didn't do that. You used that as an asset to help others.
Well, I tell new injuries, the only way to give meaning to what you've gone through and what you've endured is to find a benefit for others. And oftentimes those are the people who have a similar injury and face the same prospects of a changed life. But when they see you, they can see themselves and all the things that we've been able to do become what they can aim for. And I love seeing that. There are so many men and women who end up injured in multiple ways. Car accidents is pretty typical in the military. I don't know if a lot of folks know that, but it's one of the highest reasons for prolonged hospitalization for folks in the military. And certainly you have folks with MS, Lou Gehrig's disease, spina bifida, stroke. Paralysis happens to an awful lot of people. About 5.4 million men and women and children in the U.S. live with some form of paralysis. But the results, we hope, are achievable in terms of having quality of life, being productive, getting back to work, going to school. We lay the pathways for those to happen, and we rely on federal funding to keep that program going.
So tell us about the National Paralysis Resource Center, Sherman. Do they get most of their funding from the federal government or a fraction of it?
Well, it may be helpful to kind of outline why it's there in the first place. The National Paralysis Resource Center responded to a need in society at the time. This was back in 2002, about 7 years after Christopher Reeve had been injured. And it was designed to give the Administration for Community Living, which is under Health and Human Services, a way to offer programs that address the unique needs of things like amputations, paralysis, traumatic brain injury. So it was really the federal government's responsibility to do this work. However, they found that the state model, sort of a fragmented approach to coordinating services across the state, wasn't optimal. And so they came up with a grant that organizations could compete for. You have to be competitively selected to get the grant, which has been the case for the Reeve Foundation. Once we could prove that we were capable of doing this work and to show our work in subsequent years where we have to show data, show outcomes, then we in turn become an extension of the federal government in this work. So the grant is entirely federally funded, but it is scrutinized by an awful lot of people and given only to the organizations that can handle the work.
And what does the funding go towards specifically for folks who have paralysis?
The National Paralysis Resource Center is set up to address 5 key focus areas. The first are information specialists, which is a hotline that provides a personalized wraparound service approach with one-on-one support for not just people with paralysis, but also their caregivers. There's also a military and veterans program that supports veterans who have problems navigating between the VA and the DOD with these catastrophic injuries. Where there's a peer and family support program that pairs individuals and families with peers to reduce isolation and improve health outcomes. We also give out quality of life grants that support adaptive sports, recreation, and local community support programs nationwide. And then finally, there's a process resource guide, which happened to be the first book placed on my rack when I was at the San Diego VA recovering. It's a guide that covers just about every question, some questions we don't even know to ask, sort of like the Bible of living with paralysis. And we produce that and update it every so often using those funds.
Mr. Gilstrap.
So what is the status of things now with the government is somewhat in flux with a lot of cuts and that sort of thing? Are these affecting you?
Yeah, this is putting it mildly. The good thing is that the National Paralysis Research Center has historically enjoyed bipartisan support, and we simply want to see that continue in fiscal year 2026. But as you know, nothing is final until Congress passes a budget resolution and the 12 appropriations bills that get signed by the president. And until we see the government open back up, we won't be certain of whether the process to continue to administer the funding is going to continue. There are a lot of changes being proposed. Some of them are probably good and much needed changes, but the ones that impact programs that work are what we hope to avoid. That's why we're here talking to your listeners today.
What would those be?
What would the
ones that you're here to talk to today that are concerning?
Sure. Well, we're talking about a lifeline that connects people who live with paralysis, which can include veterans, children, and adults, to what they need to achieve quality of life. It also relieves caregivers of the burden of having to manage this process alone. And if it's defunded, then we'll suffer the consequences as a society. You know, people with paralysis and caregivers back in 2002 and before were isolated by a lack of support and misinformation and feeling disconnected. And I think we'll find ourselves asking the same questions we asked in 2002 that led to the creation of the center in the first place. We've already proven that paralysis doesn't have to be a life sentence, but if we return to a time when people can only expect to survive with paralysis instead of thrive in terms of reaching their education, work, and family planning goals, then the disabling aspect of those situations will be a return to a broken system, not a medical condition. And so we want to prevent that from happening. We also want folks to get involved if they're inclined to, and we want to use this opportunity to let them know, A, what the center does, and then B, they can go to ChristopherReeve.org to read more about the center. Maybe they know somebody who's living with paralysis and has no support. And there are multiple ways to get involved, whether it's running a marathon, fundraiser, or maybe even advocating locally.
Sherman Gillums, Jr., Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Reeve Foundation and a Marine veteran living with paralysis, is our guest here on the program. I understand you have some data, some polling data as to how people feel about this funding, Sherman?
Well, I didn't want to turn this into a political thing, but what we find is that across the board, in just about every political party, people are highly favorable of the approach we take to addressing paralysis. Paralysis and disability itself, it's above politics. It's, anybody. We've had congressional members of Congress who are Democrats in the halls of Congress with paralysis. We've got Greg Abbott down there in Texas doing a great job with what he's doing for that state. It respects no demographical boundaries. And so even though we could look at how the data break out, who supports what, overwhelmingly everyone supports a holistic, nationwide approach where the best practices have been determined already. And we want to see that continue no matter what political party a person belongs to.
So just to be clear, is funding for NPRC threatened? Is it being cut, or do you just want to make sure that it is not going to be?
Well, there were a lot of programs, the programs of significant emphasis, such, again, TBI, paralysis, they were all proposed to be reduced under the president's budget. Not even reduced, but sort of replaced by other functions in the government that have already been proven not to work as well. And so once that happened, we have to make the case for why, if you're going to cut programs, this doesn't need to be one of them. And so there is a sense that we could lose this funding. The problem is, even though the Congress, through the appropriations committees, have passed and asked for the funding to continue, that doesn't mean that the president's budget has changed. And if the president gets what he wants, we're going to see a lot of programs go away. We don't want this to be one of them. And so we have to make the case, not just before Congress, but before the American people, so that people know exactly what's at stake here. And we were very fortunate that the both houses of Congress recognized through their committees, at this stage at least, that this is important. The problem with the shutdown is all the administrative processes stop. And so there's no guarantee that when the government opens back up, what's going to be left to help process what needs to go through in order for this to continue. So we may see disruptions or altogether defunding. Now, at this point, it's not looking as bad as it did maybe 2 months ago, but things can change very quickly, as we're seeing, and we just want to make sure that we're on the right side of that change.
We have a minute left. Sherman, how can our listeners help you and your cause, sir?
The best way is to go to ChristopherReeve.org. We've got a litany of resources there for people who may need it. We also have ways in which people can get involved, and we want to ask people to find their place in the mission somewhere, somehow, and we'll welcome that.
Bill, final word is yours.
Hey, I just want to thank you, Sherman. Thank you for serving our country, and thank you for what you're doing, that you're that advocate for people that don't have a voice.
Well, we continue to serve, as you know.
Yes.
It's my honor.
Thank you, Sherman. I wish you all the best, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Sherman.